Good evening. I just want to welcome you to our Critical Conversations event tonight, and it's my pleasure to introduce Boris Groys, who is our fourth speaker this term. I'm going to read a very abbreviated bio, a relatively abbreviated bio for Boris. For those of you that may not be familiar with his work. Dr. Groys is a philosopher, essayist, art critic, curator, and media theorist. He is considered to be one of the most important art theorists working today. In the 1970s, Boris, who had studied philosophy and mathematics at Leningrad State University in the former Soviet Union, immersed himself in the unofficial cultural scene in Russia's capitals, coining the term, quote, Moscow conceptualism. From 1976 to 81, he held a position as a research fellow in the Department of Structural and Applied Linguistics at Moscow State University. And in 1981, Boris immigrated to West Germany, where he earned his PhD in philosophy at the University of Munster. Boris is the author of The Total Art of Stalin, which introduced Western readers to Russian postmodernist writers. His philosophical writing includes A Philosopher's Diary, On the New, a study of cultural economics, and The Invention of Russia. His contributions to art theory and criticism include Vanishing Point Moscow, The Art of Installation, Under Suspicion, a phenomenology of the media, Ilya Kabakov, The Man Who Flew into Space from His Apartment, which was published in 2006 by, after all, MIT Press. In 2009, MIT Press published Art Power, which you're undoubtedly all familiar with in one way or another, which has become already in the past really just year or so, rather a year and a half, a rather influential track. And just recently, already in 2010, his book, The Communist Postscript, was published by Verso. Boris has served as a curator and organizer of numerous international art exhibitions and conferences since the 1990s, and has served as professor of aesthetics, art history, and media theory, and senior fellow Academy of Design at the ZKM, Center for Art and Media Technology in Karlsruhe, Germany, for the past 15 years. Currently, Boris is the Global Distinguished Professor of Russian and Slavic Studies at New York University in New York. So I want to welcome Boris. He got here through the snow and the rain last night into LA, which was a great relief, and we're very pleased that he is here tonight, and please welcome him. Thanks very much. Oh, do I need to make the announcement about videotaping? Yeah, I should. Just to let you know, we are videotaping Boris's talk tonight, so that you're aware of this. But,
okay. So, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm glad to be here for the introduction. So, in my talk today will be time-based art, and I will not show actually any images, because it takes some time to show time-based art in a way that it can be understood. And so I decided not to do it at all, but instead of that, just to speak about it. So, it seems to me that the presence of time-based art is the most characteristic aspect of the museums of contemporary art, general exhibitions of contemporary art today. And the reason for that cannot be only seen in the fact that the time-based art is a recent phenomenon, historically speaking. Contemporary art is truly contemporary when it is not simply recently produced. The recent past is also already past. Contemporary art should semanticize the contemporary as such, the here and now. The current interest in contemporary art, which is obvious, museums of contemporary art all over the world, and biennials, numerous exhibitions, publications, etc., actually reflects our current interest in the contemporaneity as such. In fact, this interest is relatively new. The question is why and why now? There could be different answers to this question, but I would propose one that I see as being especially relevant for the topic of this lecture. Under the conditions of modernity, the present time was perceived in an ambiguous manner. The modernity was a time of projects, of living in the projects, directed towards the future. Now the present time opens a way into the future because it led us to formulate, to design our projects that should, as we think or hope, determine or at least influence the future, our future and future in general. But at the same time, the present prevents us from realizing our projects. The present time puts obstacles in our path, made our hopes and plans become inappropriate, and not up to date, or simply impossible to realize. Time and again we are obliged to say, yes, it is a good project, but at the moment we have no money, especially in financial crisis, no time, no energy to realize it. Cool. This tradition is wonderful. Wonderful one, but at the moment there is nobody who is interested in it and wants to continue it. Or this utopia is beautiful, but unfortunately today no one believes in utopias, etc. So the present was mostly seen in the modernity as something negative, as something that slows down the realization of our projects, that delays the coming of the future, as something that should be overcome as soon as possible in the name of the future. A couple of Soviet novelists of the 20s parodied this kind of attitude toward the present by the slogan, "Comrades, sleep faster." This idea of sleep faster means that you kind of fell asleep in the past, and then you sleep through the whole present time, so that you can wake up already in the present future. So actually the present was experienced as something that you actually would prefer to sleep through. That Ernst Jünger, German author of the 20th, 30s, famously said that modernity taught us to travel light with minimum baggage, with light and repair. To be able to move further along the narrow path of present, modernity reduced everything that seemed to be too heavy, too loaded by meaning, by mimesis, by the traditional criteria of mastery, by inherited ethical and aesthetic conventions. Modern reductionism is a strategy of survival on the way from the past to the future, through a difficult present. However, in our time, the role of the present has changed. It has ceased to be a moment of transition from the past to the future. Rather, our present time has become a time of reconsideration of the rewriting and recreating of the past. Today, everybody writes a new historical narrative by the inclusion of excluded and/or the exclusion of the included, reshaping his or her cultural identity, redefining his or her own origin or heritage. This process of reformulation, redefinition, rewriting of the historical past takes time, potentially and indefinitely long time. If we are permanently rewriting our past, and that is what we currently do, then we cannot know where our past has ended and where the future can be. Today there is no unified universal history anymore. Every intellectual artist tells his or her own version of the universal history. The historical past has become an artificial product, a work of art, instead of being a framework and horizon of our common practice, including artistic practice. The great historical narratives have not dissolved, as some postmodern theoreticians expected them to do. Instead, they began to proliferate at an increasing speed. Thus, history begins to be not something that unites people, but something that differentiates and separates them. Every historical narrative defines its own past, present, and future. But what about our common contemporaneity? What about the present that would be our common present? Such a common present could be only possible when we would live in the same universal history. But when the historical narratives become radical heterogeneous, as they became now, and everybody lives in his or her own history, I mean, it's not one's own individual biography, but one's own interpretation of the universal history. Then the synchronization, or one can say contemporalization of these heterogeneous histories, becomes an almost unrealizable goal. Our common contemporaneity became utopia for us. That is something that is reflected by many philosophers and historians. I don't know if you know the name of Kozelik, the German historian who speaks about contemporalization. I would translate from German, of heterogeneous histories, of the impossibility to build a universal history, of the simultaneous of something that is not simultaneous as historical terms. Now, the time-based art can be seen as an attempt to realize, in the framework of art at least, such a utopian project of contemporalization, an attempt to create an artistic model of the collective contemporaneity, and at the same time to demonstrate all the difficulties that we are confronted with when we try to realize such a project. First of all, the time-based art is not merely shown in the art exhibition spaces, but is actually produced by them. Under the rubric of time-based art, we understand film, video, music concert, or poetic readings turned into a film installation, video installation, sound installation, etc. But of course, to show a film in a film installation, instead of showing it in a cinema, or to play a piece of music in a sound installation, instead of playing it in a concert hall, radically changed our perception of the film and of the music. Obviously, the growing number of filmmakers, musicians, and poets begin to welcome this change and the transporting of their works into the museum rather than into cinema and concert hall. And what is even more important, the number of film, video, sound, etc. installations is permanently growing, notwithstanding the possibility of distribution and circulation of films, videos, and music that is offered by the internet, for example. I remember the times as the digitalization of art was hailed as its liberation from the curatorial institutional control, from the closed spaces of the art museums and Kunsthallen. That's why the time-based art is increasingly shown as exhibition space. What is the additional aesthetic value that is produced by putting film and music into art exhibition? Now, first of all, the video, let us speak about video as a paradigmatic example. Running in the video installation demonstrates in a very immediate, obvious manner the heterogeneity of its own time compared to the visitor's time. In our culture, we have two different models that allows us to synchronize, to contemporalize the time of contemplation and the time of artwork itself. Immobilization of the artwork or immobilization of the spectator. The immobilization of the image in the art exhibition space, of the text in the book, of text and images on the computer screen, or the immobilization of the spectator in the theater, movie theater, concert hall, in front of the TV screen, etc. Both models, however, fail when the moving images are transferred into the art exhibition space. In this case, the images keep moving, but the spectators also keep moving. One does not remain sitting or standing in an exhibition space, rather one goes back and forth through the space again and again, remains standing in front of an image for a while, moves closer or away from it, looks at it from different perspectives, and so on. The viewer's movement in the exhibition space cannot be arbitrarily stopped because it is constitutive for the functioning of the art system, that you move inside the art space. In addition, an attempt to force a visitor to watch all the videos or films in an exhibition from beginning to the end would be doomed to failure from the very start. The duration of the average museum visit is simply not long enough. And the videos are often long, from time to time, even very long. One need only remember in the Warhol's movies that are very, very long. But also operas of Messiaen Stockhausen or Züberberg's movies, and also, of course, videos of people like Fischler Weiss producing by 300 hours of videos and more. Of course, you cannot spend 300, 600 hours in exhibition list. So, if you go to look, even not 7 hours, like in case of any walk. So it is obvious that this causes a situation in which the contradictory expectations of a visit to a movie theater and visit to a museum conflict, sending the visitor to a video installation into a state of doubt or helplessness, especially if you have exhibition of many videos, like for example 60 or exhibition video. So it's something that is impossible to see. And I think that is to the beginning to the end. So I think that what is brought by the time-based art into art is impossibility to see. What is traditionally expected from art that is exhibited is that it's exhibited in a way that it is seeable by the visitor. Yeah, that was a very traditional assumption. It is also a traditional assumption if you go to the theaters that you can see the piece from beginning to the end, and if you go to the cinemas that you see the film from beginning to the end. So you can interpret that in this way or that way. You can be so much impressed by an art work that you stand still for 100 years and then die in front of this masterpiece, but you can see the body of work. And what's interesting about time-based art for me is that you can't. Yeah? So what time-based art brings in the first place in the art space is the invisibility. So the visitor to an installation basically no longer knows what to do. Should he or she stop and watch the images moving before his eyes, like the movie theater? Or should they, like in a museum, continue the movement in the confidence that over time the moving images will not change so much as one feels they will? Both solutions obviously unsatisfactory. Actually, they are not real solutions at all. Actually, I have a very revealing experience in my life. I was preparing for a lecture sitting in an exhibition of Andy Warhol movies, not very far from Empire State Building. And then a guy came to me and said, "Do you know the movie?" More or less, yeah. Could you tell me when somebody will be killed? So I come to this moment. So that was this desperate attempt to contemporalize and synchronize your own time with time of the work of movie. Of course, it was not impossible to realize. Here, all the difficulties of contemporalization was on time with the heterogeneous times of exhibited video, film, or sound narratives become immediately experienceable for the visitor. In the traditional art exhibitions, the unmoving images are arranged by a curator in a way that they tell something like a universal art history, presenting a fragment of that history. But in the exhibition of the time-based art, every video film tells its own heterogeneous history. These histories can be visited by us, but we can see only fragments of them. We can never grasp them in their entirety, not in the sense of interpretation, but simply not the whole body of the work. Because we cannot see the whole body of individual work, we can't also formulate an aesthetic judgment on it. That is probably what makes time-based art especially attractive for the artist. The possibility to escape the final aesthetic judgment by a spectator, to escape the appropriation by the gaze of the spectator, to remain partially unseen, ungrasped, and elusive. And of course, everybody experiences that if you go to a major exhibition, like biennial, this or that, there's a lot of time-based art. And after a while, you meet your colleagues, and so what do you think about that? So, I don't know, I didn't see it. So I can't say at the moment. So I drink coffee and maybe come back. Because people never come back. So they never build any judgment. They can't. Okay. So the basic experience that the viewer has in a video installation is the experience of the non-identity of the exhibited work. Each time someone visits a video exhibition, he or she potentially confronted with another clip from the same video. The non-identity of the video images also presents itself in another, and it's, as it were, a deeper level. Like a film, a video is initially produced as a copy. But can one say that all of the copies of one film are identical to each other? As long as a film is shown under standardized conditions of a visit to the movie theater, one can perhaps say, yes, they are. So if you want to look at the Avatar, and we go one time and again, we think we see the same movie. It's only two different but completely identical copies. However, the situation is fundamentally changed if the film is shown within the framework of a film installation in an exhibition space. Because in this case, both the space as well as the duration of the presentation are explicitly synthesized. One begins to compare the film with other objects or works of art possibly found in the same exhibition space. Paintings, photographs, text, and so on. In the end, a copy begins to distinguish itself from another copy of the same film by the way in which it is shown, presented, curated, contextualized. However, the non-identity of the image manifests itself even more clearly in the case of the video because of its digitality. The digital code of the video as such is invisible. And when it is made visible, for instance in a famous scene from the film Matrix, that's a revolutionary pill, this code is radically different than the image that was recorded and stored with the aid of this code. Here the image begins to function as a piece of music, whose score, as is generally known, is not identical to the piece that is not audible but final. For the music to resound, it has to be performed. But this means that a piece of music is essentially non-identical to itself, only its chords. The self-identity of the traditional analog image is actually also an illusion, which conceals a specific curatorial practices of presentation, conservation, restoration, etc. For somebody who is accustomed to European museums and is accustomed to look at traditional European art at the European museums, all the Italian, French, and whatever art that you see in the USA looks like American art, because they are restored in a way in which they will never be restored in Europe. So actually, it's completely different impressions that one gets, but one actually does not reflect on that because of the convention of the museum system. But video makes this kind of concealment structurally impossible. Here it becomes completely obvious that in order to be seen, the image has to be performed. Any presentation of an image file is as original as in a theater or as a concert performance. So one can view videos with the aid of a video recorder, but also projection on television with the context of video installation of the monitor or computer, on a cell phone and so on. In all of these cases, the same video file looks different on the surface, not to mention the very different context within which they are shown. If one changes certain technical parameters, one also changes the image. And these kinds of change are unavoidable because technology is constantly changing, hardware, software, everything. In this way, the image should also transform with every new presentation. Can one perhaps preserve all technology so that the image remains self-identical? And these attempts are made time and again to create some kind of effect of authenticity. Yeah, you can, for example, visit exhibitions of, I don't know, 20s or 30s films like of massive broadcast, where the conditions of the production and the reception at that time are technically reproduced. But it's very interesting that if you look at that exhibitions, if you follow the behavior of the spectator, it was at least my experience, they are much more interested in this old, technique, much more than the images themselves. Siegfried Krakauer, German art historian and critic of the 20th 30s, remarked that preserved technology shifts the perception of a technologically produced image from the image itself to the technical conditions under which it was produced and presented. So if you look, for example, at the old photographs from the 19th century, 20th century, you immediately react to the fact they are old photographs and not to the image itself. Thus we are less interested in the subject in all photographs or the individual attitude of the photographer. What we primarily react to is the old-fashioned photographic technology that becomes apparent when we look at all photographs. The artist did not intend to produce this effect. However, as he lacked the possibility of comparing his work with the products of later technological development, that the image itself may possibly be overlooked if it is reproduced using the original technology. But also decision becomes understandable to transfer this image to new technological media, and that happens time again also. New software, hardware, to look fresh again. With the strategy of the image updating, however, one gets caught in the same dilemma out of which, as the general known, contemporary theater is unable to come. Because no one knows what is better, to reveal the epoch or the individuality of the play, but its contemporary performance. And both strategies fail to a certain degree, whatever strategy you take. Today's technology thinks in terms of generations. We speak of computer generations, generations of photographic and video equipment. But where there are generation conflicts, multiple struggles. Anyone who attempts to transfer his or her old texts and images onto new software can experience the power of the Oedipus complex over current technology. Many things are lost in the process, many things are destroyed, get lost in darkness and become blind. However, one can also use technical constraints productively. One can play with the technical quality of digital image on all levels, including the material quality of the monitor or the projection surface, the external light, which as we know substantially changed the perception of the video image. Not to mention that one can only fundamentally change the image to the context of its presentation. Thus each presentation of digitalized image is a recreation of this image, so there is no such a thing like a copy. In the world of digitalized images, we are dealing only with originals, only with performances. That means only with original presentations. Thus, we are forced to radically rethink and redefine our notion of the fate of images in the age of the technical reproducibility, as described by Benjamin in his famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. In this essay, Benjamin assumes the possibility of a perfect reproduction, which no longer allows a material distinction between the original and the copy. Benjamin insists on this projection, this perfection time and again, in various passages in his text. He speaks of mechanical reproduction as a most perfect reproduction, which may not touch the actual work of art. So Benjamin wants to imagine the most extreme possibility of absolute perfect mechanical reproduction. That was actually not possible in his own time, but was imagined by him. In which traditional art like painting or sculpture become absolutely reproducible and thus begin to function under the same circumstances under which, for instance, photography or film function. That means under condition of the original undistinguishability between original and copy. So the famous question that Benjamin asked is if we achieve such a perfect reproducibility, is still a difference between original and copy? Of course, he says no. There is an aura. There is an aura, and the aura gets lost if we place, if we begin to circulate the cards. So the aura, he describes the aura as a place, historical place of the original, here and now of the original, in the feeling of the distance that we have to this here and now. So actually, his definition of aura is completely topological. The aura is not like a soul of the things. It's something that functions as a historical context. So if you take something out of the context of his presentation and begin to circulate it in an anonymous way, then what happens is the loss of aura. Now if we take seriously this definition, then we should infer that installation is actually an operation that functions as a reversal of the operation of reproduction. Because what installation actually does, it does put individual copy into something, into some here and now. So installation does nothing else as that it inscribes the copy into a certain place, gives it a certain time, and brings it into history in this way. That is not only, of course, film or whatever. Look at artists, for example, using something like I don't know, newspapers. This newspaper is a copy. It's also by definition a copy, and it's also identical copy. And has no aura from the beginning. Yeah, that's why Benjamin also liked the press. Yeah. But if you put this or integrate this piece of newspaper into the artwork and the art installations, then suddenly it gets a completely different value. It becomes to be authentic, it becomes to be kept, it becomes to be restored, it becomes to be watched on, it becomes to be historically relevant, and suddenly we get this kind of distance to a certain inscription here and now that we actually don't if we are confronted with a newspaper as identical copy of other possible number of newspapers. We actually don't know this number, yeah? So indefinite number of newspapers. So this example, I think, shows clearly enough what kind of operation we have to do here. And if you look at the digital version of what I just described, then of course that shows the function of installation in a relationship of digitalization, namely the installation and the use of time-based art in the museum context destroys kind of utopian or pseudo-utopian belief in something like an immateriality of art. Yeah? And this ideal of art being immaterial being virtual, yeah, it became very popular at a certain point in time. And a certain utopian desire was invested in it. We heard about all possible things like immaterial worker and many things like that. So we listen to this kind of discourse coming to us from different perspectives about immaterial. Just to go back to anecdotal, I once had a conversation with a guy that I don't know personally very well, just at a dinner, and director of John Kunsthalle, and asked him what he shows, and he said to me, I show mostly material art like paintings, drawings, sculpture, but I don't show immaterial art. So why you don't show immaterial art? He said, because it's too expensive and too heavy. So I think it's revealing here, because in fact, what happens if you begin to reflect on different kinds of digitalization, digital art, in an artistic context, is that you begin to reflect hardware. What we actually do not, if we remain in the position of somebody looking at the screen. I think this kind of illusion related to the immateriality of virtual art has to do with a certain position of somebody looking at the screen and ignoring the computer, ignoring the chair, ignoring the position of one's own body, ignoring the whole equipment, ignoring the electricity, ignoring the money that is paid for the electricity every month, ignoring all that, yeah, ignoring all the system, looking only on the image itself, and on some kind of eternally concealed code, yeah, behind it, so kind of matrix, yeah, behind it. But behind the digital image is not a code and not a matrix. Behind the digital image, like behind every software, is a hardware. Like behind the soul is a body. So what installation art, if time-based art installed in it, what it does reveal to us is a body of the virtual, material body of the virtual. So it does open us a possibility to escape this kind of false discourse on the immaterial, alleged immaterial. But there's also another aspect of the time-based art that is especially important in the framework of this lecture series, I believe. I kind of try to make a review of certain points that can be discussed here after all. In her famous book, Understanding Media, Marshall McLuhan made a well-known distinction between hot media that isolate the individual spectator from his or her surrounding, and cool media that makes the entire communication space perceptible. According to McLuhan, hot media, the most important example of which is writing and reading, lead to social fragmentation. When reading a book, you feel yourself alone in a focused state of mind. You forget about your body. In fact, the same happens if one goes to a concert or to a movie theater. Visitors to a concert, theater, or cinema are to forward directed to the station screen. For them to be able to sufficiently perceive and reflect upon the space they find themselves in, or the communities they have become part of. Of course, McLuhan thought that only electronic media, such as TV, are able to overcome the isolation of the individual reader or spectator. However, sitting in front of a TV screen or computer, as well as using the internet, one is also alone and focused. In fact, the only really cool medium that we have at our contemporary disposal is an art exhibition. Of course, one can use an exhibition as a book to wander alone from one object to the next, Like one turns pages in a book, one after another, one's inner being, separated from outside reality, concentrated in front of individual artwork, contemplating it with due intensity and authenticity. Probably because of this traditional image of the ideal spectator's behavior, be completely immersed in a contemplation. McLuhan did not describe an art exhibition as a cool medium. But today's exhibition takes mostly a character of an artistic curatorial installation. Here the whole of the installation space is understood as a work of art. Such a totalizing, holistic view of the exhibition space does not favor the traditional movement of the spectator from one exhibited object to another one. In this case, the viewer does not stand in front of the work of art, but enters it, positioning his or her body inside the art space. Anything exhibited in such a space becomes a work of art only because it's placed inside the space. The distinction between an art object and a simple object becomes insignificant here. Instead, what becomes crucial is a distinction between a marked art installational space, that is art space, and unmarked profane public space of outside. The individual work of art, in the sense of a single art object, thus definitely loses its autonomy. The installational space transforms into art anything entering it, including visitors. It is only the work of art, but also the visitor who loses his or her autonomy. One could say the visitor becomes an exhibit as well. Actually, also experience that everybody had. I think I had it for the first time as I went to, I think, first European huge European exhibition of the net art, with like 200, 300 computers running different programs, of different net artists, and it was a huge space with dim light that looked absolutely baroque, because some young people were sitting in front of these computers, and I was reminded of, Georges de la Tour baroque paintings with candles. Yeah? So it's actually functioning as candles. And it's really functioning as candles because we, that was organized by the center where I'm working in Surkheim, had no experience to deal at that time with such huge exhibition. So all this computer didn't work. And actually one couldn't see anything. But at the same time, all the places were occupied. And I asked myself why people are sitting there. There's nothing to see. Yeah? Partially they check their emails and so on, it's okay. But they were still sitting there, and I think that they were sitting there to become artworks, and they really became artworks. You went to the space, it was very beautiful. This is why the contemporary art space is capable of including all sorts of hot media. Text, movie, video, music, individual images, so as to make them cool off. This is what the installation actually is all about. It serves the purpose of cooling down all the other media. Or put it differently, the installation transforms individual artworks into elements of the holistic art space. Such a space does not invite the visitor to concentrate on individual art object or film or soundtrack. The whole point of building an exhibition of the time-based art is to take a look at it, and then another look, and another look. One can say that the act of contemplation itself is put here in a loop. There's a scarcity of time that we need to see all the exhibited time-based artworks in their entirety, transforms itself into an excess of time, offering a possibility of looking around or seeing community of visitors as a part of the exhibition. That, should I read this part of my text? Probably not. But it is inspired by also some collaborations with filmmakers, for example, Zilberberg, some others, who actually made movies like 10 hours showing somebody reading poetry. I also was participating in a couple of these projects by Alexander Kluge. He made I think 5 or 6 hours me talking about communism and Marx, and so it is something nobody could stand, nobody could see, of course, into that. So even if it's a try to do so, it's a try to do so in the night, Munich, and Frankfurt, and Cologne, to show this film from beginning to the end. And actually it never worked, yeah. I saw one movie, The Night, I don't know if you know that, by Zilberberg, reading text about night, 8 hours. And at the end I was the only one in the space, everybody left. So you have certain time conditions that are unbearable for the public, but at the same time, it is unbearable for the public under very specific conditions, namely, someone is sitting glued to the chair, 2 hours, many hours, in a dark space of a cinema, looking at the screen, is actually a torture. Anyway, even if it is 2 hours, it is torture. What's interesting about film in general, and that was writing a bit, but I summarized it in a couple of sentences, is that the movie was celebrated from the beginning to the end as a medium of movement, as a medium of active life, as a something that mobilized the masses. And actually, if you look at the people who are inspired filmmakers from the philosophical traditions, it's of course Marx, it's of course Nietzsche, it is of course all the authors of Vita Activa, all the authors of Vitalistic, up to Deleuze, up to Gilles, also very vitalistic. At the same time, the position of the spectator is a parody of this kind of activist discourse. In fact, the degree of immobilization of the spectator is unique. Yeah? It's a maximum of immobilization in the cinema. It's something that Guy Debord and some other French, mostly, theoreticians and artists were angry reacted against. Yeah? Already actually Buñuel reacted against that. So they wanted, maybe I understand. So they wanted to provoke some movement in the audience, yeah? To bring people out of the chairs. But in fact, being more and more and more radical, they put spectator more and more syndicated in the chair. So dynamization of the film and mobilization of the film actually produced total immobilization of the spectator, and actually Debord was very, very much aware of this power. Very nervous about it. So what's interesting is that the remobilization of the spectator that we experience in the film installation has to do with erasure of movement in the movie itself. So the movie itself becomes less and less a movement, more and more repetitive. It's not accidental that I speak about. Spoke about Andy Warhol, but of course, films of Guy Debord are actually illustrated lectures. And also, if you look at some other avant-garde productions of this kind, you experience almost no movement in the movie. And this no movement in the movie actually produces the movement through in the public, in the audience. Produce the movement in the audience not only because the audience can try through the film installations, but also in the first place because every visitor, every spectator has to decide to go away or to remain. And this decision, the necessity to decide, and the possibility to decide every moment, something that you don't have in a movie theater. At least you don't have this compulsion to decide. Makes for a visitor its own presence palpable, experienceable. You experience with much more intensity your own time in exhibition because your decision to go has consequences. It's not like a traditional, for example, decision in traditional space to go from one painting to another painting. Because if you go from one painting to another painting, you do not miss anything. You can always return to the same place. What's interesting about time-based art and about this kind of exhibition is that you decide to miss something. And you decide it consciously, and you have a responsibility, you take a certain responsibility. It seems to be a very light responsibility, but it is a responsibility, and this responsibility, you feel it, yeah? And feeling this responsibility, you feel a certain use of your own time that is much more active and that more reflected than in any other condition, I would say, in contemporary civilization. Furthermore, the visitor to such an installational space is not an isolated individual but part of the visitor collective. An individual visitor is namely incapable of a holistic, totalizing view of the whole of the art space, including himself. So this kind of space can be only perceived by a mass of visitors, a multitude, if you like, with this multitude becoming part of the exhibition for each individual visitor and vice versa. Today, art is frequently equated with the art market and the work of art identified as a commodity. That art functions in this context of the art market and that every work of art is a commodity is beyond doubt. But art is also made and exhibited for those who do not want to buy a work of art. And this constitutes the majority of the art public. The typical exhibition visitor rarely sees the art exhibited as a commodity. But the number of large-scale exhibitions, biennials and triennials, is constantly growing. All these exhibitions in which so much money and energy is invested are not made for art buyers, but for large masses, and for the anonymous visitor who will perhaps never buy a picture. And art fairs, like Frieze or Muslim Fair, which on the face of it are meant or were meant at the beginning for art buyers only, are now being transformed into events in public space with lectures and programs, which also attract people who have no interest in buying. The art system is on the way to becoming part of the mass culture. The art has long been out to watch and analyze from a distance. It is becoming part of mass culture not as a production of individual pieces traded in the art market, but as an exhibition practice that combines with architecture, design, and fashion. As was envisaged by the pioneering minds of the avant-garde, by the artists of Bauhaus, Gutenberg, and others as early as the 1920s. Does that mean that art has become identical with mass culture today and has lost its capacity for reflecting on it? I don't think so. There is one dimension to mass culture which is often overlooked but becomes particularly manifest in the art context. A pop concert and film screening creates communities among those attending them. The members of these transitory communities do not know each other. The structure is accidental. It remains unclear what all these people have come from and where they are going to. They have little to say to one another. They lack joint identity or previous history, which would provide them with joint memories to share. Nevertheless, they are convinced. And I would say that today's art increasingly manifests itself as a design of human masses. That it is very obvious if you looked at huge exhibition like Documenta or Venice Biennial. So what happens here is a kind of policing of the masses. So people reckon from the beginning with like 2 million, 3 million people coming, going through the exhibition. And now the question is how to police these masses, how to move them in certain direction, how to let them decide or not to let them decide where to stay and where to go. I don't know if you saw the last exhibition or last Documenta. Yeah? This last Documenta never let you stay in one place because the Documenta was organized in a way that next one always pushed you forward. It was a kind of labyrinth of very narrow ways, so that the idea was the idea of the flow. It was a kind of delusion, concept of people never staying in front of something, but always moving through a certain kind of art landscape. So you, of course, designer and curator of this exhibition took certain decisions how to manipulate these masses in a way that they behave a certain way and the other way. The Third Art Historical Museum was built in Berlin, and it was built in a committee that decided how it had to look like. Two philosophers were sitting, Schelling and Hegel, and they made their proposals. And Schelling proposed to make a system of rotundas, so that people coming to kind of closed space and contemplate the eternal beauty, being completely immersed in the space of eternal beauty. And Hegel proposed a system of galleries, so the people only move through the museum, imitating the movement of absolute spirit that moves through different stages of history, but never actually stands and remains still and looks at something but moving ever further. So what actually people did, they combined these two propositions, and they made Schellingian rotundas to contemplate eternal beauty, and long galleries that were filled by the works that were not so eternal or were not, not evaluated by the curators as being eternal. So it was a compromise. And of course, if you look at every contemporary exhibition, you see this compromise revisited. So today's art, increasingly as it is clearly manifests itself as installation-based exhibitions, it deals directly with design of human masses. That it takes over purely political, even policing functions, by creating spaces that impose certain rules of behavior upon visitors, which may well also have an anarchist or Dada character. Here, art practices global policies in the sense that it designs a transitory global politeia, transitory global state, which tries to compensate for the lack of real global policies on the part of the contemporary nation states. Well, the main political problem of our time is this. There is a global market economy, but there is no global politics, because politics are only locally or nationally defined. So the art system of today functions as an experimental model of global state of the future, of global state in general, of the present. A model about which not only good things can be said, but which seems all the more instructive precisely for that reason. What contemporary installational art spaces mainly offer to the fluid circulating multitudes is an aura of the here and now. The art exhibition visit is above all a mass culture version of individual flaneurship, as described by Walter Benjamin, a place of collective profane illumination, as he described it. So in our democratic age, contemporary art space becomes a space in which human multitudes demonstrate themselves to themselves, and maybe even celebrate themselves, as former times gods and kings were viewed and celebrated in temples, churches, and palaces. Thank you. That was it.
So Boris, you can sit behind the lectern or closer to us and
Oh yes, I think if I sit here,
it's okay, yeah?
I remain visible. Yeah. At least partially. Yeah.
I want to return to a point you made about one of the key premises of the false discourse of the immaterial being, this notion of the ideal spectator fixed to the ideal image. What would be an alternative discourse or vocabulary that wouldn't devolve into apparatus theory or technological determinism or narrativization of some other sort?
Well, I think you can go a different way. In any way, if you begin to reflect on the materiality of the material body of the virtual, and maybe I'm too Marxist in this respect, traditional Marxist, but I still believe in a priority of material basis here in relation to superstructure. But of course, if you follow the way of basis, you actually never end. So it's of course apparatus theory, but it is of course also economy. And it's of course also, cosmological place of this whole hardware in the nature, because it kind of collaborate with the nature, or actually spoil the nature and whatever. Yeah? And it is of course politics and of course economy, and it is of course a history, yeah? Because all these apparatuses are of course products of certain kind of scientific tradition,
So in fact,
and so on.
you would reintroduce a language about exchange and
Yes, I do, yeah.
economy. That's, yeah.
Yeah, I do. But not economy in a market sense of the word, not economy in a market sense of the word. But economy in a sense of, if you want, symbolic exchange. So in a sense of what has symbolic value in our culture. Because symbolic value in our culture is not quite identical to the money value. For example, we can say, this artist is a bad artist because he is too commercial. Yeah? And already the possibility to say that shows that there is a gap between symbolic economy and money economy, market economy, even if they, of course, also exchange through this gap and through this border. But there is a gap and there is a border. So, of course, it's certain kind of symbolic economy. But the symbolic economy is that goes into the material, yeah, that does not remain on the level of on the level of virtuality, on the level of the surface, and so on and so on. Because if you maybe I tell one word. So where is this different? You know, if you look at that, you know, traditional French philosophy. Different people, yeah, of course. But you have always this infinity, yeah? You have infinite work of deconstruction, you have infinite flow of desire, you have infinity here, you have infinity there. And it doesn't look for me too persuasive here, because where are all these infinities? Yeah, people are tired. Yeah, they are not desiring eternally. Yeah, they're maybe writing like Derrida, a lot of books, but still not eternal or infinite work of it. So if I speak about materiality, I speak about finiteness, and I speak about mortality, and I speak about skeptic attitude toward any concept of infinite flow of whatever. Yeah. So that was I have in mind. First place.
I wanted to ask at the beginning of your discussion about this multiple historical narratives, sort of describing what we're left with after the postmodern critique of the universal narrative. And I wonder, how do we talk about politics in that context? Are these multiple narratives kind of depoliticized because we can't share them?
Well, I think there are different ways of thinking politics in that, but one way, of course, is to ask the question of what is universal and what is contemporary for all of us. If it's not history, what is it then? It is, for example, can be production of histories and manifestation of history. It's interesting that if you look at exhibitions, big exhibitions of contemporary art, you see a presentation of very heterogeneous cultural identities, very heterogeneous histories, but they are presented in a very similar way. Yeah, because it's always photographs, it's always text, some video, certain kind of narrative, so there is a certain gap between heterogeneous content and a very universal and standardized way of production and distribution of this content. Then if you move from these exhibitions to the broader media, if you look at Facebook, if you look at this, if you look at that, yeah, then you see absolutely the same means and the same ways of producing, of self-production, let's say, yeah, of self-production, using by not professional artists, by 100 millions of people, placing texts, certain investigations, certain reflections, certain historizations, certain video on the website. Yeah. So I think one way of making things political is to ask the political and materialist question. What is the material basis? What is the technological basis? What is a universal economical basis, political basis for this kind of historical production and distribution? And how they communicate with each other, and how we use the mechanism of their contemporarization, and what kind of techniques and what kind of policies we use for that. Yeah? And for example, for me also, big exhibition, I said, are political, and political not in the sense that they express a certain political opinion, but in the sense that they effectuate certain policy of contemporarization and creation of this universal space or global space for all these individual discourses and manifestations. Yeah? And that is, if you want, yeah, genuinely political decision. Yeah? That is politics pure.
Yet the nation state continues to try, in certain instances, to reassert itself into this free-floating space that you described. I mean, in the traditional model of Biennale, whether it's Venice or Sao Paulo, right, there is that contradiction there as well. terms of its origins, or whether you're talking about the origins of the document as well as essentially as a nation-state project, deeply political in at least one sense. And can you talk, maybe reflect a little bit about those frictions that you might see between the nation-state continuing to seek to reassert itself in one, symbolically or materially, versus this kind of cosmos, if you will, of the nebulousness of this post-utopian art world that floats around?
Yes. First of all, we do have, it's an institutional problem in the first place, yeah? So we do have system of collectioning, so everything that has to do with transmitting of the heritage, yeah? So museums with their permanent collections, universities, libraries, and so on and so on. All of them are national. There are no international effective institutions that would be able to effectuate this kind of intergenerational, transfer of the heritage. And that means that all these exhibitions and all these projects are ephemeral, yeah, in a certain way. They do not lead to any systematic, to any systematization, and do not lead to building any tradition. And what happens is that they actually begin to work subversive in relationship to all these traditions. So you see suddenly that the museums, even Louvre, British Museum, Tate, Berlin Museum, and so on and so on, begin more and more function not as a places of permanent collection, so not as a places where national history, the history that shows us what we were and what was our way and where we are now, they are actually begin to function as exhibition spaces more and more. Yeah, the role of permanent collection goes down. And museums work and function more and more as exhibition spaces. And I think that is quite clear where we see the tension. The tension between national and international, if you want. That is a tension between temporal exhibition going through different museums, different countries and so on the one hand, and permanent collection and history of art connected to that and connected to the university, art history as it taught at the university, so on and so on. So you have this tension. But the tension is not released. This tension is still there.
It's not released.
It's not released.
But could you characterize even the idea that the universal exposition as embodying that tension, or at least a certain kind of nascent version of that tension between the idea of the nation state attempting to universalize itself in relation
I don't
to,
see that.
No?
No, I don't see that.
I'm talking about the 19th century.
Yes, but I don't know if I look at what happens in America. It seems to me that politics of collection and politics of education and so on, it's American in America. Yeah. And if I look at Europe, it Germanized in Germany more and more, and it Gallicized more and more in France and so on and so on. So that universities and museums and histories go more and more nationalistic, especially in the new states of Eastern Europe, especially in some of the most of post-colonial states and so on and so on. Everybody wants to form its own history, its own national identity, so on and so on. So there is no general institution, there is no concept of international art or culture history.
Encyclopedic institution?
No, in fact there is not. And instead, this universalism begins to act not as a constructive, but as a subversive energy. So, in a situation in which there is no general, institutionally rooted authority that would be able to take this kind of universal view, every curator, every intellectual begin to be universal. Yeah, look at what happens. Yeah, from Badiou onward, everybody thinks universally. Why? Because everybody substitutes this lack of universality as institutional authority. So actually, every prominent curator and documenter and elsewhere creates his or her own version of universal global history. Yeah? And for 3 months. Yeah? Yeah? After 3 months, this universality and globality disappears. And in some other place, be it Sydney, be it, I don't know, Shanghai, you have another curator on another project, and they create their own discourse and theory and history and vision and presentation of the global, and it disappears again.
But is that a post-historical argument? I mean, then
It's not a post-historical, I would say. We don't have post-history, we do have something like a meta-historical. We have a space not of dissolution of big discourses or narratives, but their proliferation. I mean, meanwhile, every PhD, graduate students here wanting to make a PhD writes his or her own universal history, meanwhile, yeah? In Germany at least. Yeah? So, yeah, because if you don't do that, you are not ambitious enough. So, the point is that the universal and the global begin to be utopian spaces of individual imagination. And from time to time, also the attempts to create something like a utopian, global, and universalist vision. And it also happens, but it happens only for a very short time. And so I ask myself, what are the goal of this kind of universal projects? I see this goal only, and I can see it only as a critique, deconstruction, putting in question national discourses based on the histories of their own national cultural identities. Yeah? So because you cannot take these discourses very seriously and believe them, if you have time and again these projects that you're confronted with. So we are in a very strange position. We are between stable, institutionalized national institutions with their stable national systems of representation, and subversive universalist projects that are limited in space and time.
is that a stalemate?
That is as it is. Look what happens. I think that will be until something like universal state emerges. So if something like universal state emerges, then this universal state creates an authority, and this authority will try to create something like a universal narrative about its own coming into being. Yeah? But as far as we don't have this universalist state, this place of this universalist state is void. And actually, everybody, every curator, every intellectual of some ambition uses this void for self-representation for some time, as far as he's capable to do so. Yeah? So it's a kind of utopian void. Yeah? But you know, historically, if there is a utopian void, somebody comes and fill it. Yeah? I don't think it would be a very nice experience, but probably it happens. Yeah.
Do you think that museums will have their own subversive message going on? Because it seems to me that the major universities, major museums of the world are actually displaying conquest more than anything else, and they're, you know, and that they have been funded as such. You know, in American museums, you know, they went out and went shopping around the world essentially to try to bring back all the things that they could purchase to then display to show their power, and it seems that this has been done in many major museums. So this idea of kind of a national discourse is actually being done using the display of other nations.
Well, to a certain degree, but you know, after all, you see in the American museums all these famous American names. Yeah, if you go through a standard American museum, through a permanent collection, maybe you can see, I don't know, one Kiefer, yeah, maybe one Boris, yeah, maybe something like that. But 90% of it is American art history, yeah, it's American art. So ultimately, display of permanent collection is display of one's own cultural identity, and even if from some other parts of the world certain images are chosen, they are also integrated in this history of one cultural identity. Yeah? It's very interesting why, for example, Impressionism and post-impressionist art, yeah, have so incredible place in American art historical imagination. Yeah? It has, of course, nothing to do with this art itself, but with specific roles that this art played in American cultural history. So if you remember something from the outside, you remember not this something, but you remember your own meeting with it. Yeah? And the place that this something, the roles that this something played in your own cultural history. So the system of representation that way is always based on a certain kind of selection, placement, that is based on the cultural history of that land, yeah, of that country, yeah, that made. But I cannot say that in relationship to big art fairs or big art exhibitions or individual projects, mostly taking place outside of the USA, I would say, probably, mostly in Europe and different places. They are really represent something like individual or group motivated global visions, yeah, of the creators. But as I said, they are kind of they are like artworks actually, yeah. So they are signed, yeah, they're individual, they're subjective. Yeah. I think you.
I was going to ask you, kind of going to the World's Fair kind of as a way of getting earlier, preceding the notion of the art fair, and specifically looking at, as you had mentioned, Frieze on one hand or Documenta, but looking at the idea of the origin of the pavilions and pavilion as a kind of model, and that it hasn't really evolved terribly far from that model, and that the pavilion in and of itself, even drawing a kind of a really shoddy parallel between a pavilion in one model physically, in, let's say, Barnum and Bailey's model of how to move the kind of circus around with the notion of tents, and trying to kind of consume a model of, you know, all of these wonders of the world coming into one place and then being able to collapse and move, and then, you know, pitch tents somewhere else. So that how that very 19th century notion of being able to propose multiple things happening in one place, kind of a form of a material aggregator of sorts. How that hasn't really ultimately evolved at all in physicality and physical space. That when you go to a place, perhaps the host city doesn't pavilion, but it gives up its real estate, but it still plays to the same thing. It's only pitching tent for a short period of time, and it's only proposing that these zones are kind of given over to those spaces for a short period of time as their pavilion. So here is our national building. It gets to be Canada for 3 months.
Yes, of course, there is a kind of tradition, yeah, also big industrial exhibitions of 9th century, so on and so on. But I think that there is a tradition, there is continuity, but there's also a break. What happens here has, I think, its real origin in early avant-garde of the 20th century, so in Black Square of Malevich, in Duchamp's ready-mades, and Dadaist, I don't know, Cabaret Voltaire. So they had introduced a very low level of acceptance of a certain object as an art object. And that gave a possibility today to include in the art exhibitions things that would never be included in 19th century. Because 19th century still was dominated by a certain concept of taste, by a certain concept of form, and by a certain claim related to art. Yeah? But if you say that everything that has something black behind it, it's a black square, is per se work of art because it's a reproduction of the black square at the same time, yeah? And everything has something black behind it, yeah? Then everything becomes art. And the same is with Duchamp and so on and so on. So the contemporary system is based on the destruction of taste, destruction of traditional value system, complete relativization and negation of the concept of aesthetic value. And then repeated at the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s. And we didn't have this concept in 9th century. And only if you have this kind of absolute reduction to the zero, only then you create the space for this global imagination. Totalizing, universalizing global imagination that can include really everything, because nothing could be excluded on the basis of not being of good taste, not accommodating certain concept of beauty or certain concept of ethics, and so on and so on. So you open the space of possible inclusion that is actually a space in which contemporary art operates, and contemporary exhibition practice operates. So we do not have this phenomenon in 19th century. I think this phenomenon is really an effect of the radical reductions of the early avant-garde. You have to absolutely go to zero, and then you create this absolute zero space. In this absolute zero space, you can put whatever you want. And that gives you a freedom. That gives you a freedom that contemporary curators enjoy, but this freedom has its roots and its origin in 20th century, in the early avant-garde.
You spoke on the phenomenon of the strolling gallery goer who makes the conscious decision to walk away or stick around as content, or a work's content unfolds or progresses. And so if we consider this strolling behavior, how should we think about curating art games, whether they be presented in digital or analog formats?
It's an interesting question. So everybody I know tries to include this, this games and the exhibition, but it somehow never works. I think it never works because it's not cool enough.
Well, it's really hard because it puts a lot of pressure on the player because the player becomes part of the artwork and the performance is being exhibited to everyone. And also, a lot of games aren't in progress unless someone's already engaged with them. So it's a problem.
It's a problem because you have, again, this kind of structuring time in a way that you have to spend some time to begin the game, and so I think there are some Eastern games, that never begin and never end, yeah. So you have to invent a game in which you cannot win or cannot lose, that has no beginning and no end. And if you invent such a game, then you can. I'm not a game specialist, I wouldn't do that. But it's quite clear that it should be structured as Andy Warhol movie, yeah? And then if you do that, then you can exhibit that. And then the people just coming in, participating in the game, going out without feeling of winning anything, of losing anything, and have the freedom to begin and to end it at any moment. So that must be a game, yeah. But I didn't see it yet, yeah. And so
There are some games where the gameplay progresses by just dying over and over and over again.
and it's not what the point, because then there's no negotiations between you and artist, yeah. The artist dominates your behavior and time, yeah. That's not the point. The real point is that you have absolute freedom. Yeah, what's interesting to me is that really I think that certain practices that I'm confronted with and looking at are very radical in the sense that they relate to this early avant-garde, and I think they are fundamental. So zero practices, not in terms of zero painting or whatever, but practices that gives you absolute freedom of entering it, going onto it, using whatever you want, yeah, showing whatever you want, not showing whatever you want, yeah, and so on and so on. So to use this possibility that the early avant-garde is opened, yeah, and has opened, and that's interesting. Yeah, as long as you are suppressed by certain kind of expectations, yeah, from the side of curator and artist, yeah, you will always kind of feel yourself uneasy and actually don't want to participate. It's also, for example, people like, they invite people to crawl into the exhibitions, like Schneider and some other people. I think it's okay. Gregor Schneider, yeah, you have to crawl. But I cannot crawl. For example, I don't want to crawl, yeah. I mean, I don't know why I should crawl. So if I would be in his place, I would make two entrances for people who want to crawl and the people who don't want to crawl, yeah. So there are people who want to crawl, yeah, for example, who want to crawl, yeah. And they should do it, yeah. But people who don't want to crawl should not, yeah. So I think the good exhibition and the good project is that gives you maximum freedom to decide your own strategy.
Can we maybe go back to the issue of the elusive aesthetic judgment that seems you're, I think, suggesting that in terms of the artist, certain artists are producing something that is going to be missing, that they're producing that kind of void,
Yeah.
to a certain extent, right? Whether it's Warhol or Duchamp in his own way. And one could if one were to take that argument, if I'm perhaps not misrepresenting at least an aspect of argument, to go back to the 19th century, right? I mean, one could look at Cézanne and say there is something missing there as well. Maybe not to zero, even though there may not really be a zero metaphorically or not, but that there is already the building of a void there, on technical terms, visual terms, pictorial terms, so on and so forth. So that I don't mean to be to invoke a kind of Alfred Barr linear argument here about modernism, but nevertheless, one can read those works perhaps in that way. So that's one issue. And then is there no, I mean, when you, of course, you're being a bit, I think, coy in terms of this question of the disintegration of aesthetic judgment, right? Because if you look at the history of the museum, certainly, whether it's late 18th century or the 19th century, and of course the evolution of the notion of a public for art, you do also have this emergent friction, or even a series of misunderstandings between the notion of art, high art, fine art, and publics that encounter this in a recently emancipated space, right, of engagement, as you invoke yourself. So there's already a series of understandings and misunderstandings that take place, right, in that earlier historical period of the evolution of the museum, which seems to in some way restage itself endlessly, in a sense, right? So I don't want to be historicist here, but I do think that there is that.
There is, of course, but you know, I think that, of course, I also see these historical things, but I think that it's important also to see the difference between you can do it in this way and that way, or you can't escape something. Yeah. For example, if you say Cézanne, yeah, you can read it in this way. Of course, you can, and we tend to do so. Yeah, of course, being trained in a certain way. But you can also look at Cézanne and not read it at all. Yeah. On the other hand, you cannot escape looking at Malevich and Duchamp to see it as this kind of minimal gesture.
When?
At the moment.
Are you positing a universal viewer, or are you positing a ahistorical viewer, or a historical, contextual, embedded viewer? Because I think...
Well, I think that people who actually looked at that, they understood it already in this way. Yeah? And this kind of understanding, we are heirs of this understanding. I remember very well, I was very impressed here at my school time, so to say, by a passage that begins Spiritual in Art by Kandinsky. He describes a visit to an exhibition. And it is a visit exhibition at the beginning of the 20th century. That is what you actually described. And he says that he goes through huge exhibition with hundreds and hundreds of paintings. And he sees flying ducks, lady in blue, a girl in rosa, two cows on the middle, yeah, and so on and so on. And he asked himself, who brought all these people, things, objects, cows, and ducks together? What has this lady in blue common with these flying ducks? And he said, I was so perplexed by this question, but I thought a long time about it. And then I realized that if you forget what you see, and you see all these things, all these paintings, only as combination, abstract combination of color and form, so you just do as if it's not a lady in blue, and as if you do not recognize the flying ducks, then you have really painting, yeah, an exhibition of painting. And then he began to paint this painting himself, indicating that he actually paints nothing else that was already painted always and will be always painted, because every image is a combination of a certain shape and certain color, so that he believed at that time that you cannot structurally paint anything that would not be Kandinsky's painting. It never was painted and never will be painted. So the problem was how to reveal the universal layer and universal view in this kind of absurd variety of images. All of them pretend to be art. Yeah? They're collected together, but what actually unites them? And it's also, of course, our contemporary experience. Yeah, we go through this also document exhibitions. We see also flying ducks, Lady Blue, in different ways, but we see this kind of variety of images, and we ask ourselves, what is it actually? Yeah, why they are all together, and what keeps them being together? In a certain way, what I said was the answer to this question. Yeah, it was kind of repetition of this gesture. And what I tried to suggest is that what unites them is the fact that they are exhibited in the same way, under the same conditions, in the same material space, under the same presuppositions. So what unites them, it's not like Kandinsky thought what they are as a combination of certain and certain, because we meanwhile know that we can escape that and still it is art. Yeah? But we cannot escape the fact of exhibition itself, because we cannot see anything that is not shown. Yeah, the gesture of exhibiting something presupposes our ability to see it in one way or another. And so what I try to do is to repeat this gesture by Kandinsky and to ask myself and the audience how we can describe this general universalist gesture that underlies any possible variety, even so heterogeneous, of images, on experiences, and understand them as being art experiences and images. So I try to describe certain kind of underlying strategy that for me is a condition of our ability to conceive of them as art at all. I don't see any further question. So.
I'm sure there are. I have more questions, but I need to let the students and others participate, so I'm holding back. This is the void that needs to be filled. Paraphrasing.
But maybe you do it, yeah.
I'm going to do it. And
Yeah,
I
we
won't
can.
become the authoritarian.
I can understand.
There's enough of it.
Yeah.
I have a question. Do you think that that an object has to be received in order to exist as an art object? I mean, do you think that whole circle of being in the exhibition space and being received by a viewer makes that?
I don't think so. I don't think that we need viewer, that art needs viewer. Because let us assume that we made an exhibition that was never visited by anybody. Yeah, it's still an exhibition, and it's still art. Yeah. So I think viewer is a part of the exhibition. So if some human bodies are in the exhibition, okay, the exhibition is a bit bigger, yeah. but in fact it doesn't change its structure. On the other hand, artwork are not at work, and we know that after Mariage de Chance. The artworks are not artworks if they are simply produced and not exhibited. Because as being only produced, they are kind of furniture, yeah? if you go into the artist space here, you see furniture. And then the artist decides to show something as art. And this decision actually creates him or her as an artist. So the artist's decision to show something as art. Yeah, as long as you don't do that, everybody makes this as that art. Everybody maybe draws something and maybe writes poetry and yeah, you know. But then you take a certain decision, a certain responsibility. And at the moment you take this decision and responsibility and you show something as art, then you enter a certain game, yeah, of criticism, you're taking certain risks, yeah, and so on and so on. And that is what art actually is, because art is, of course, not a peaceful activity, it's intellectual activity. It is a participation in certain kind of war, yeah. Always people speak about art system, it's not a system. It's always competition, and it's always conflict. It's a space of competition or conflict. It's a space of symbolic wars. And to become an artist or to become an intellectual is to become a warrior. Yeah? You decided to go to war. Yeah? So now, as far as you remain peaceful, yeah, it's not art. Yeah?
You mentioned earlier this duality of hot and cold, in terms of what you spoke about it as a curatorial aspect. And I've just recently been reading about your description of the iconoclastic. And does that relate to the cooling effect?
Well, yes. It's beginning of the cooling. It's beginning of the cooling. It's beginning of the cooling because the ultimate point of this iconoclastic strategy is, or maybe not the ultimate, of course, gesture, but it's early avant-garde gestures. Of course, for me, it's kind of example of that. And of course, it's a cooling off. But I think that the cooling off begins, and it's a relatively new phenomenon. It's not avant-garde phenomenon. At the moment you accept the partial invisibility or maybe complete invisibility of your work. So you accept the conditions and you even produce the conditions under which your work will not be completely seen and will not be completely grasped, and so on and so on. Yeah. And you make that consciously. And you can make that not only by using video, of course. Yeah. If you look at, I don't know, people like even what could be a good example, Hirschhorn, for example. Christoph Berg. You have artists that create by different means such a massive overkill, visual overkill, that you can't grasp it. Yeah, you can't read all the books here in Hirschhorn exhibition, yeah, and you can't understand what is the ground of the selection. Yeah, you can't follow all these aspects of that. Yeah. So from the beginning, he takes a decision to put the visitor in a situation of choice, in a situation of selection, to produce a visitor that is conscious and responsible for what he or she wants to see. And in a certain way, at the same time, he creates a distance between him and the viewer. Because whatever strategy you choose and whatever decision you take, it's non-commensurable with a project of Hirschhorn himself. So you always kind of do not reach him, do not quite are on the same level, at the same altitude of reflection and on observation, of the project. You always have something incomplete. You're always incomplete, partial, fragmentary.
Isn't that an intrinsic condition of authorship, both conceptually and otherwise, that there is always that relation established, no matter how supposedly or putatively deeply participatory a work is, whether it's Capra, in which there's collaboration, or the viewer supposedly completes the work in some way, or enacts the work, or actualizes it. And we have various generations of this. That are you concerned about a false illusion of freedom that is generated within these spaces of the installational space, and more, in a broader sense, the space of the periodic exhibition, that this simply reproduces a certain false consciousness of freedom that is essentially, well, not identical to, but somewhat analogous to the broader notions of democracy, perhaps?
I don't think so, no. And if it is, then it is a revelation of this notion actually is. Because if you have a installation space that is democratically organized, and where you take this democratic decision and develop your democratic freedoms, then at the same time, as I said, you have the concept of creator, of lawgiver, of somebody who creates the space and gave you the possibility to use the space democratically, but you can never achieve the sovereignty. So you are free inside the space, but you are not sovereign in the space. So and I think that is revelatory, in relationship to our reality, because people also seem to neglect the fundamental difference between the notions of freedom. It's a freedom of choice, it's a sovereign freedom. Freedom of choice is a freedom to choose inside already existing system of choice, already existing options. And sovereign freedom is a freedom to create these options. And so installation is a place where artist functions as a sovereign, and visitors function as citizens of democratic state. And the relationship and a gap between them are obvious, much more obvious than in the real politics. But also we can say that in this case we have an attempt on the side of artists, on the side of intellectuals, to escape the problems that Derrida already raised. So if you get a book of somebody and you read this book, this author is dead for you, says Derrida, because you are not interested in him anymore. He has nothing to say. Then you begin to interpret that, you begin to think about that, but you are not interested in that. He is kind of dead. But you can't kill Hirschhorn because you never read it. It's like Dumas, or it's like Proust. I was actually an exhibition that I liked very much. It was in Paris. It was time-based exhibition. It was exhibition of the reading of À la recherche du temps perdu, of Proust novel. And it was organized in a way that through months and months, people, artists came and read part of the book, and the next part. So 24 hours interrupt. So you could come and visit this novel to get this kind of insight and it's of course also because Proustian language and Proustian narrative is so kind of, it's also like Andy Warhol, yeah, in a certain way. And so you can enter, you can go out, yeah, and everything is okay. Yeah? And so you could use this text not as a book, but as a certain space that you can visit and go out. Yeah? Could we say that this possibility is already in Proust? Yes. But if you didn't do that, you don't know it. Yeah? So I have to do that, to reveal this possibility. That is inherent, yeah, of course.
Do you really need to propose that all installation in this sense operates allegorically, like, let's say Hirschhorn, or let's go further back and say Grotars, as opposed to, you know, is there not other installation that goes to the degree of totalization, like Jonathan Misa, or, you know, anything else that proposes that verges more towards the Gesamtkunstwerk, more towards the totalizing atmosphere of the subject completely? That's number one. And number two, wasn't the original point of Grotars that as soon as the allegory is proposed, it is exhausted immediately? It is not, in fact, infinite like Proust, and that any attempt to resurrect it immediately reverses itself, that the market immediately subsumes the very critique that was proposed against it.
This space, yeah. Is it allegorical? Maybe. But it is a real space, yeah? And sitting here, we are in real time, because whatever is said, yeah, one thing can be said with absolute certainty. We are 2 hours near to our death, all of us, yeah, during this time. So this is a real time. It's a real time of life that is erased by this event. That event taking place in a real space. There is a material basis of that cannot be reduced to critique, that cannot be reduced to allegory, that cannot be reduced to anything. It's something very, very material. And then, if you look at Jonathan Mesa, yeah, Jonathan Mesa is an artist that makes all this, you know, Nietzschean, Hitlerian, I don't know what kind of gestures. Yeah? But he does it in a way that they destroy themselves immediately. Yeah? He makes these gestures, very heroic ones, and laughable at the same time. Yeah? And improbable at the same time. So what you get at the end is the same point zero, yeah? And that is why he can, we also collaborated on one project with him, so I know him very well. And also with Christoph Schlingensief, yeah? Actually, all that is different versions of Christoph Schlingensief activities. Yeah? And Christoph Schlingensief, he developed this kind of magical theater of huge Wagnerian Nietzschean gestures, but at the same time, he completely denies them through kind of Dadaistic context, the varieté context of their appearances.
And this sort of faux homeopathic gesture is somehow meant to be instantly self-validating? I don't understand. How is that anything other than, I mean, the easy route is to say spectacle, but how is that to be anything other than complete abjection from the beginning? How does that escape and activate any kind of space unto itself? I fail to understand.
Well, as I try to say is that we have this national traditions, we have these cultural traditions, we have this individual projects, we have these histories and with that histories, yeah? And then we ask ourselves, of what are the universalist, what are the global conditions for the production, how we can reflect that. And I think that this reflection is useful and can be useful in different ways. It can be useful as a critique, it can be useful as affirmation, it can be useful simply because it's interesting, yeah. It can be useful in different ways. Yeah. It can be useful maybe because it can be sold in the market. I don't know. It can be also useful. Yeah, money is also useful. So it can be useful in different ways. But this usefulness in different ways is one thing. And substantiality of this reflection in itself is another thing. So the question is, if we would say there is no space like that, yeah, and this question is impossible to ask, whatever, I would understand your objection. Yeah, but I think it's question that is possible to ask. Yeah. So the question is possible to ask, what are the general conditions of self-creation, self-presentation, of different identity, individual culture, and so on in our civilization, the specific conditions which we are living in. Yeah. And we can ask this question, we can reflect on that, we can draw some conclusions. So these conclusions can be critical or non-critical. It depends on how we stay in it.
Earlier this afternoon, we've been talking about this problem as curators, as artists. And I was wondering how that problem applied to your concept of artistic installation. Can a curator create an artistic installation or space? So you bring up this idea of soft continuum.
It seems to me that we have, of course, a difference. Yeah, I wrote about this difference, that in a certain way, curator as somebody representing the state has no such freedoms, such sovereign freedoms the artist has. Even if a curator wants to be creative and wants to be radical, wants to be this and wants to be that, of course there are some responsibilities that artist also has, of course, but maybe not to such a degree. So I think in our culture we have still certain kind of difference between our attitude to creator and artist, even if this differentiation is a cultural convention. But conventions are important. The cultural conventions, in fact, we have the same strategy, of course. It's showing, putting some things in a void. Yeah? And looking how they look like. Yeah. And not because we are interested in these things, or maybe we are interested in these things, but we are interested in there is a void. And we are interested in the void because there is no pure void, so there's always, as I said, void in the material structure of the world. So there's always not general space, but this space, and not general hardware, but this hardware, and not general time, but this particular time, and not, yeah, and so on and so on. And so we are working with some kind of abstraction, but this abstraction immediately brings us to the heart of our material world. Yeah.
My question was somewhat similar to Alexis's question. I was wondering if you could discuss sort of the role of the curator and also the notion of the curator being an institution by definition.
Yeah. It's difficult to say because we have to look at what kind of, yeah. I mean, if you look at the system in Europe, for example, then it's mostly the state that individual curator is responsible to, mostly. But it can be also political movement. It can also be a critical group. It can also be a movement. If you know that Green Party that emerged, and Boris was part of it. Organized also exhibitions, curatorial projects, and performances, and so on and so on. And they were oppositional, and they were working toward certain ideology and certain political project that was at that time not part of the state politics. Green Party became part of the official state politics much later. So the role of curator is to represent certain interests. Yeah, he represents certain interests. That can be political interests, that can be national interests, and that can be commercial interests. A lot of curators simply represent commercial interests, yeah, and nothing else. Yeah, they just make something like a vitrine for selling, possible selling of certain objects. You know, something kind of a window. You know, for so we looking at what individual curators do. We have to analyze how the strategy is, and of course, this figure of independent curator emerged in the 60s in Europe, and at that time, the leading curators were in this group were very oppositional, and were also massively supported by also parlamentarische Opposition, but by non-parliamentary opposition. Yeah, we shouldn't forget that also. So there are different political venues and different political interests and different strategies. So in every individual case, one has to look into what happens in this particular case.
Can I just ask you to reflect briefly, carrying on from what you're saying, but the idea of the curator as perhaps a figure who he or she, or as a collective, perhaps intervenes, the notion of a certain intervention in relation to a particular situation that may involve political crisis or fraught with certain kinds of territorial disputes. I'm thinking of the manifesto that was canceled, the school that Anton Bedoki and his collaborators worked on that eventually became a void in a sense. In terms of Cyprus, Nicosia, territorial border conflict, so which was deauthorized as part of the manifesto project. What do you think about those either strategies and or tactics in which a curator will actually endeavor to target a particular hotspot, if you will?
Yeah, it happens very often, of course. Yeah, it happens very often. And it's difficult to generalize, because maybe it's different examples. But all the examples I know, and Anton's document was one example, that I have in mind because I was also involved in that, yes, and of course I was involved in, I'm still involved in some projects in Eastern Europe, especially Russia, that are pretty conflictual. Then the general structure of this conflict is a structure between this, let's say, universalist imaginary and national local politics. So Anton comes to Cyprus, and he was to show something like an international exhibition. But the people in Cyprus were not interested in the international exhibition. They were interested in how many Turks and how many Greeks are there, and they were absolutely not interested in anything else. And they were interested in what kind of money flows into the buildings that are rented in a Greek part, and what kind of money is flowing in the Turkish part, And at that point, they thought there is no balance, yeah, because more money was flowing to the Turkish part as in the Greek part, yeah, and there were more Turks involved than Greeks, yeah, and so it was finished. So you have, in a very clear way, this kind of conflict. Yeah? And of course, if you make an exhibition in Moscow at that time, you don't have state censorship. It doesn't exist really. But you have powerful institutions like church, some organization of Russian patriots, and so on and so on. And they find, for example, certain images not good for Russia. Yeah? And so they begin protesting against it. So, and if, and the curators always say, well, it's not against Russia, it's just what happens, yeah, on the global international scale. But they are not interested in what happens on the international scale. They are interested in their own propaganda and their own national problems. So I see in all the cases I was involved in, this conflict about global imagination that is represented by this project in a very energetic way, and local conflicts and local unwillingness to participate in this imagination, yeah, just the rejection of any relativization of their own national cultural ideals and so on. You have the same thing in Poland, very, very massive way.
But didn't, I mean, in terms of the idea of an art school constituting, filling the void of the art exhibition in the case of that particular manifesto, was there a sense that perhaps the art school would function to ameliorate these local political problems as a kind of utopic, as a kind of neo-utopian space, right, in which ultimately all conflicts are not necessarily resolved, but can be worked out within an educational context in a way that would not alienate particular interests?
Yes, but it's the same. What kind of art school? The art schools that produce this kind of art, yeah, that is circulated everywhere. It's like Bauhaus in Germany. Yeah? You know, per se, Nazi regime was not against Bauhaus, as you know. Bauhaus people also made projects for Buchenwald and also designed a crematorium for Auschwitz. So per se, there was no conflict. But it was a feeling that as a project in general, Bauhaus is not German. Yeah? The question was simply how this kind of project is related to the immediate problems of German national identity. Yeah? It's no relation. And it is absolutely the same problem there. So the problem was not the art school per se. The problem was how this art school is related to needs of Greek population in the struggle for the national identity in this place and that time. Yeah? And this neglect, yeah, was provocative and was, of course, made provocative consciously. Yeah? Because the answer was, we are not interested in your, yeah, we are interested in different things. Yeah? Forget for a minute, yeah, all this stuff, yeah? Just change your mind and look at things from a different perspective, yeah? But they simply didn't want to do so. That was the problem.
When you talk about exhibition spaces when you're talking about video work, did you mean traditional exhibition spaces like a museum or a gallery or the White Cube or the pavilion?
Every possible space.
So, for instance, like someplace like Times Square, would that be a cold experience where someone's inserted work in it?
Yeah, of course, yeah, but Times Square is already a space, yeah. So you can insert something in there, but it's already an exhibition space. Yeah. Times Square is already completely artificial, yeah. Of course, we are trained to look at every possible space as an exhibition space. Yeah, exhibition space should not be specifically built. Yeah, it should be constructed. Okay.
Okay, Boris, thank you so much for being here with us today.